The night was dark, and the rain poured heavily, turning the road into a shining black river. The wind howled through the empty highway, making the trees shake as if whispering secrets to one another. Marcus gripped the steering wheel tightly, his tired eyes focused on the road ahead. It had been a long day at work, and all he wanted was to go home, take a hot shower, and rest. His car moved steadily through the storm, the headlights cutting through the thick rain. The sound of raindrops hitting the windshield was loud, but Marcus barely noticed. His mind was occupied with thoughts of the unpaid bills sitting on his kitchen counter and the extra shifts he needed to take at the repair shop. Life hadn't been easy, but he was managing, one day at a time. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw something on the side of the road. A car, its hazard lights blinking weakly through the rain. At first, he thought it was an abandoned vehicle, but then he saw a figure standing next to it. A woman. She was alone, her arms wrapped around herself, her body shaking from the cold. Her hair was plastered to her face, and even from a distance, Marcus could see the fear in her eyes. She kept looking around, as if expecting something or someone. His first instinct was to keep driving. It wasn't safe to stop for strangers at night, especially in weather like this. He had heard stories of people using fake emergencies to trap drivers. But then he thought of his mother's words. She had always told him, if you have the power to help someone, do it. You never know when you'll need help yourself. Letting out a deep breath, Marcus slowed down and pulled over a few feet ahead of the stranded car. He turned off the engine but kept the headlights on. Taking a quick look around to make sure no one else was hiding in the shadows, he reached for his hooded jacket, pulling it over his head before stepping out into the rain. The woman turned sharply as he approached, her eyes wide with both hope and fear. "Hey," Marcus said, raising his hand slightly to show he meant no harm. "You need help." The woman hesitated. Her lips trembled as she spoke. "Yes, my tire." She pointed at the back wheel, where a completely flat tire sat in the puddle-covered road. I don't know how to change it." Marcus glanced at the tire, then at the woman. She looked exhausted, as if she had been standing there for a long time. Her clothes were soaked, and her fingers shook as she clutched her phone. He gave a small nod. "All right, I'll take care of it." Without waiting for a response, he walked over to the trunk of her car. "You got a spare tire?" The woman blinked, as if trying to understand the question. Then she quickly turned and opened the trunk. Inside, a small spare tire sat next to an old, rusted jack. Marcus grabbed the tools and crouched beside the car. The rain dripped from his hood as he worked, his hands moving quickly and skillfully. He had changed hundreds of tires at the auto shop. This was nothing new. As he loosened the bolts, he noticed the woman glancing at her phone, her fingers typing something before she quickly hid the screen. Her eyes flickered toward the road behind them. Marcus felt something uneasy settle in his chest. She was nervous. Too nervous. "You all right?" he asked, tightening the last bolt on the spare tire. The woman jumped slightly at his voice. "What? Oh, yeah, I'm fine. Just a rough night." Marcus didn't press further. It wasn't his business. He stood up, wiping his wet hands on his jeans. "You're good to go now." The woman stared at him for a moment, as if unsure what to say. Then, suddenly, tears welled up in her eyes. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered. "You have no idea how much this means to me." Marcus shifted uncomfortably. He wasn't used to people getting emotional over a small favor. "It's nothing," he said, forcing a small smile. "Just be careful out here. Weather's bad tonight." The woman nodded, but she still looked shaken. She opened her car door, but hesitated before getting in. I have to go," she said softly, glancing over her shoulder again. "Thank you." Without another word, she shut the door, started the engine, and sped off into the night, her tires splashing water onto the wet pavement. Marcus watched as her car disappeared down the road. Something about the whole situation didn't feel right. The way she kept looking around, the way she clutched her phone so tightly, as if waiting for a call she didn't want to answer. He shook his head. It wasn't his problem. He had done his good deed for the night. But as he climbed back into his own car and pulled onto the highway, he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that he had just stepped into something much bigger than a simple flat tire. And he had no idea how much danger that small act of kindness had just brought into his life. The sound of rain faded as Marcus drove through the quiet streets, but the uneasy feeling in his chest remained. He had done a simple thing, helped a stranger in need. It wasn't the first time he had helped someone, and it wouldn't be the last. So why did this feel different? His fingers tightened around the steering wheel as he replayed the moment in his head. The woman's face had been pale, her hands shaking even after he fixed the tire. She had looked around constantly, as if expecting something to appear out of the darkness. And then she had left in a hurry. Marcus sighed and shook his head, trying to push away the thoughts. He was just tired. That was all. After a long shift at the repair shop, his mind was probably imagining things that weren't there. The city lights flickered outside as he pulled into his apartment complex. It wasn't much, just a small one-bedroom place with old furniture and creaky floors. But it was home. He parked his car and sat for a moment, listening to the rain tapping against the windshield. His phone buzzed. Marcus pulled it out of his pocket, expecting a message from his boss, or maybe a reminder about bills. Instead, it was from an unknown number. Be careful who you help. His breath caught in his throat. For a second, he just stared at the screen, reading the message again and again. Was this a joke? Maybe one of his friends messing with him. His heart beat a little faster as he quickly typed a reply. Who is this? 3 little dots appeared, showing that the person was typing. Then they disappeared. Marcus waited, his grip on the phone tightening. No response. Nothing. A chill ran down his spine, but he forced himself to take a deep breath. It had to be a prank. Things like this didn't happen in real life. He had probably just helped someone who was in a bad situation, and now they were being dramatic. Still, the uneasiness didn't leave. He locked his phone, grabbed his bag, and stepped out of the car. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, and the air smelled fresh, but something felt off. As he walked up to his apartment door, he glanced around. The parking lot was mostly empty. A few cars were parked near the entrance, and the streetlights buzzed softly in the night. Then he saw it, a black SUV parked across the street. It hadn't been there earlier. Marcus frowned, staring at the vehicle for a moment. The windows were tinted, making it impossible to see inside. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe he was just on edge because of the text message. Shaking his head, he unlocked his door and stepped inside. The apartment was quiet, the dim glow of the streetlights casting shadows across the walls. He tossed his keys onto the kitchen counter and went straight to the fridge. Grabbing a bottle of water, he leaned against the counter and took a sip, trying to shake off the weird feeling in his gut. It was just a coincidence. It had to be. But as he walked to the window and peeked through the blinds, the SUV was still there. And it wasn't moving. Marcus exhaled slowly. Maybe he was just being paranoid. Maybe it was just a neighbor's car. He couldn't let his mind run wild over one strange message. Still, he double-checked that his door was locked before heading to his room. Lying in bed, he stared at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of the city outside. He had helped a stranger. That was all. Tomorrow, everything would go back to normal. Or at least, that's what he hoped. Morning came, but the uneasy feeling hadn't left. Marcus got ready for work, grabbing his jacket before stepping outside. He took a quick look across the street. The black SUV was gone. Letting out a breath of relief, he shook his head at himself. He had been overthinking. Of course, the car wasn't watching him. That was ridiculous. He got into his own car and drove to the repair shop, pushing all thoughts of last night to the back of his mind. The day started like any other. Oil changes, tire rotations, and fixing old engines that made customers curse under their breath. Marcus kept busy, enjoying the rhythm of work, the way his hands moved on their own, knowing exactly what to do. It was only after lunch that the strange feeling returned. He was under a car, checking the brakes, when he felt it, someone watching him. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. Slowly, he slid out from under the vehicle and glanced around. A man stood near the entrance of the shop. He was dressed in dark clothes, his hands shoved into his pockets. His gaze was locked on Marcus. Marcus wiped his hands on a rag, trying to ignore the way his pulse picked up. "Hey, you need something?" one of his coworkers asked the man. The stranger didn't respond. He just stood there for a moment longer, then turned and walked away. Marcus frowned. He didn't like this. It was probably nothing. Maybe just a lost customer. But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. Something was happening. And it all started the moment he decided to help that woman. By the time Marcus finished work and got back into his car, he was exhausted. But as he pulled out of the parking lot, he checked his mirrors, and his stomach dropped. A black SUV was a few cars behind him. It wasn't a coincidence. Not this time. His grip tightened on the wheel. He took a few extra turns, going down unfamiliar streets, watching to see if the SUV followed. It did. A knot formed in his chest. Who were they? And what did they want from him? His phone buzzed again. Another unknown message. "You shouldn't have stopped for her." Marcus swallowed hard. This wasn't just a prank. This was real. And he was in trouble. The city lights blurred past as Marcus tightened his grip on the steering wheel. His heart pounded in his chest, but he kept his face calm, his movements steady. If he panicked now, he would make a mistake. And something told him that making a mistake could be dangerous. The black SUV was still there. It followed him, never too close, never too far. Whoever was inside wasn't trying to catch him. Not yet. They were watching, waiting. Marcus took a deep breath and glanced at his rearview mirror again. The SUV's headlights glowed in the dark, silent and steady. His fingers twitched against the wheel. He needed to think. This kind of thing didn't happen to people like him. He was just a mechanic, living a simple life, working long hours to make ends meet. He wasn't involved in anything illegal. He had no enemies. So why was he being followed? His mind went back to last night. The woman in the rain, her pale face, the way she kept looking over her shoulder. He had thought she was just scared of the storm. Now he wasn't so sure. Marcus turned onto a different road, leading away from his apartment. If they were following him, he wasn't going to lead them home. He needed to be sure. He switched lanes, slowed down, then suddenly turned left at the last second. The SUV followed. His stomach clenched. This wasn't random. This was real. Marcus exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay calm. If they were following him, they wanted something. But what? And more importantly, how far were they willing to go? His phone buzzed again. For a split second, he hesitated. Should he check it? Keeping one hand on the wheel, he picked up the phone and glanced at the screen. Another unknown message. "You're making this difficult." Marcus's jaw tightened. His pulse hammered in his ears. He had seen things like this in movies, in books. But this wasn't a movie. This was his life. And it was getting dangerous. He needed a plan. Up ahead, he spotted a gas station with bright overhead lights. A few cars were parked there, and the inside of the store was still open. People, witnesses. If they wanted to do something to him, they wouldn't do it in a public place. Marcus pulled into the gas station, parking near the entrance. His hands were steady, but his heart was racing. He waited. A few seconds later, the black SUV drove past. Slowly. It didn't stop. It didn't turn around. It just kept going. Marcus exhaled sharply, his shoulders dropping slightly. He wasn't safe, but at least for now, He had some breathing room. He sat in his car for a moment, gripping the wheel, thinking. His mind raced through possibilities. Who were they? What did they want? And why had helping a stranded woman put him in danger? Marcus took another deep breath and grabbed his phone. It was time to get some answers. The apartment was silent, but Marcus could hear his own heartbeat, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock on the wall. Everything felt louder in the stillness of the night. He sat on his couch, staring at his phone, the screen glowing in the dim light. His mind was spinning. The black SUV, the messages, the woman in the storm. Everything pointed to one thing. He had stepped into something he didn't understand. His fingers hovered over the phone screen. He had thought about calling the police, but what would he even say? Someone is following me. A strange car keeps showing up. I got a weird text message. That wasn't enough. He needed proof. Letting out a deep breath, he placed the phone down and rubbed his face with his hands. Maybe he was overreacting. Maybe the SUV was gone now. Maybe. Knock. 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 Marcus froze. The sound was soft but firm. 3 slow knocks against his front door. His body tensed. He hadn't been expecting anyone. It was almost midnight. Who would come to his apartment this late? He stood up, careful not to make a sound. His heart pounded against his ribs as he moved toward the door. The peephole was small, but when he looked through it, his breath caught in his throat. A woman. She stood there, her hands clasped together, her eyes darting nervously down the hallway. Her hair was damp, and her clothes were wrinkled as if she had been running or hiding. It was her. The woman from the storm. Marcus hesitated. Every instinct in his body told him this was trouble. But something in her eyes, something desperate, made him reach for the doorknob. He unlocked the door and opened it just a little. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice low. She swallowed hard, looking over her shoulder before meeting his gaze. "Please," she whispered. "I need your help." Marcus didn't move. "Who are you?" he asked. She bit her lip. I can't explain everything right now. But I had nowhere else to go." She glanced down the hallway again. "They're watching me. And now, they're watching you too." Marcus's stomach tightened. "Who?" Her hand shook as she gripped the edge of the doorframe. "I can't stay out here. Please, let me in. I swear, I won't cause you trouble. Just give me a few minutes." Marcus hesitated. Every part of him knew this was a bad idea. He didn't know this woman. He didn't know what she had done. But then he remembered the fear in her eyes that night. With a quiet sigh, he stepped back and opened the door. She slipped inside quickly, closing the door behind her. She stood in the middle of the room, arms wrapped around herself, her eyes scanning the apartment as if checking for danger. Marcus folded his arms. "Start talking." She took a shaky breath. "My name is Evelyn." That wasn't enough. "And?" She hesitated, then ran a hand through her hair. I saw something I wasn't supposed to. Something dangerous." Marcus narrowed his eyes. "What kind of dangerous?" She swallowed hard. "The kind that gets people killed." A chill ran through Marcus's spine. He had expected something bad, but not this. "You have to be more specific," he said. "I don't know what's going on, and I don't like being followed by people I don't even understand." Evelyn looked down, biting her lip. For a moment, she was silent. Then she whispered, "They killed someone." The words hung in the air like a heavy weight. Marcus's stomach dropped. She lifted her gaze, her eyes filled with something between guilt and terror. "I didn't mean to see it. I was in the wrong place at the wrong time. But they saw me. And now they're trying to erase me." Marcus inhaled sharply. "And now they think I'm helping you." Evelyn nodded. Marcus ran a hand down his face. He had wanted answers, but now that he had them, he wished he didn't. This was real. This was dangerous. And now he was in the middle of it. The night felt heavier than usual. The air was thick with tension, and Marcus could feel it pressing down on his chest. He stood near the window, barely pulling back the curtain as he peeked outside. The street was quiet, but that didn't mean it was safe. Somewhere out there, they were watching. Behind him, Evelyn sat on the couch, her arms wrapped around herself. She hadn't said much since she told him the truth. Marcus had asked more questions, but she had only given him short, fearful answers. "They don't stop," she had whispered. "Once they mark you, they don't stop." Marcus clenched his jaw. He wasn't the type to get involved in things that weren't his problem. But now, this was his problem. He had helped her that night on the road. And now, the people after her thought he was part of it too. He turned back to her. "We can't just sit here," he said. "They followed me today. They know where I live." Evelyn nodded slowly, but she didn't look up. Marcus sighed. He needed to think. He needed a plan. Then his phone buzzed. His stomach dropped before he even looked at the screen. Another unknown message. "You have one chance. Bring her to us." Marcus stared at the words, his fingers tightening around the phone. He felt a wave of anger rise in his chest. These people thought they could control him. They thought they could scare him into doing what they wanted. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. "They just sent me a message," he said, turning the phone toward Evelyn. Her face paled as she read the words. She swallowed hard. They don't send threats unless they're ready to act." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. "They want you," he said, voice steady. "But they know I won't give you up just like that. So they're setting a trap." Evelyn met his gaze. "Then we set our own." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "What are you saying?" She took a deep breath, her hands gripping the edge of the couch. "They expect us to run. They expect us to be scared. But what if we don't? What if we turn it around on them?" Marcus frowned. "You're talking about walking straight into danger." Evelyn nodded. "But on our terms." Marcus exhaled slowly. He didn't like it. Every instinct told him to run, to disappear. But deep down, he knew it wouldn't matter. These people weren't going to stop. So maybe it was time to stop running. "All right," he said finally. "We do it our way. But if we're doing this, we need a real plan." Evelyn's eyes darkened, but she nodded. "Then let's make one." The trap was set. Now, they just had to survive it. The silence before a storm always felt the same. Thick, heavy, waiting. Marcus could feel it in the air as he sat behind the wheel of his car, his fingers gripping the steering wheel. The plan was simple, but the risks were high. Next to him, Evelyn sat still, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. She looked different now, not just scared, but determined. Whatever she had been running from, she had decided to stop running. Marcus exhaled slowly. "One more time. You sure about this?" Evelyn nodded. "I have to be." The message had been clear. They wanted Evelyn. They expected Marcus to hand her over. But instead of hiding, they had decided to go to them, on their own terms. Marcus had chosen a location. An old parking lot, mostly abandoned, where no security cameras would catch what was about to happen. If things went wrong, there would be no one to help them. The SUV had followed them here. Marcus could see it now, parked at a distance, its dark windows hiding whoever was inside. Evelyn took a shaky breath. "I know they're not just going to let me go." Marcus clenched his jaw. "Then we make sure they don't get that choice." He opened the door, stepping out into the cold night air. The SUV's engine rumbled as if in response. Evelyn followed, staying close to him. Her hands were shaking, but her eyes were steady. The SUV doors opened. 3 men stepped out, dressed in dark clothes, their expressions unreadable. The one in the middle was taller, older, with a scar running down his cheek. His eyes locked onto Evelyn immediately. "You made this difficult," the man said. His voice was calm, almost amused. "But it's over now. Get in the car. Evelyn didn't move. Marcus took a step forward. Why? Why is she so important? The man smirked. You don't need to know. Marcus's hands curled into fists. Then you don't get her. The man's smile faded. You don't understand what you're doing, do you? He sighed and took a step forward. She saw something. She knows something. That means she disappears. Evelyn's voice was quiet, but firm. I know what you did. For the first time, Marcus saw something shift in the man's face. A flicker of something. Surprise? Annoyance? Evelyn lifted her chin. You killed the wrong man. Silence. Marcus glanced at her. What? Evelyn swallowed hard. That night, I saw them take someone. I thought it was just a robbery. But I stayed hidden, and I saw what really happened. They didn't just kill him. Her voice wavered. They were looking for something. A name. And he didn't have it. Marcus turned back to the man. And now you're trying to cover it up. The man's jaw tightened. She talks too much. Marcus felt it before he saw it. The moment everything shifted. The way the man's hand twitched. The way the other two men tensed. They weren't going to talk anymore. They were going to end this. Marcus's heart pounded. The truth had changed everything. But it might not be enough to save them. The night had never felt so long. The cold air pressed against Marcus's skin as he stood there, every muscle in his body tense. The three men in front of him were motionless, but he could see it in their eyes. They were ready to strike. Evelyn was breathing hard beside him. She had spoken the truth, and for a brief moment, it had unsettled them. But now, the silence was dangerous. Marcus clenched his fists. He wasn't a fighter. He wasn't some kind of hero. But he knew one thing. He couldn't let them take her. The man with the scar took a slow step forward. You think you've changed anything? He asked, his voice low and sharp. We always clean up our messes. Marcus's heart pounded. He needed to do something. Then, the sound of sirens filled the air. The man's face twisted in frustration. The others turned their heads, their bodies tensing. Evelyn let out a shaky breath. I told you, she whispered to Marcus. We set our own trap. Marcus glanced at her, realization dawning. She had called them. Before they had left for the parking lot, she had sent an anonymous tip to the police, told them where they would be, told them something big was happening. And now, the flashing red and blue lights cut through the night. The man with the scar took a step back. His jaw clenched. Run, he ordered his men. They turned, sprinting toward the SUV. But before they could reach it, police cars screeched to a stop, blocking their escape. Officers jumped out, guns drawn. Hands in the air. Marcus exhaled, his legs suddenly feeling weak. It was over. Evelyn didn't move, her eyes locked on the man with the scar. For a moment, he just stood there, staring at her, as if memorizing her face. Then, slowly, he lifted his hands. The police moved in, cuffing all three of them. One officer approached Marcus and Evelyn. We got a tip, he said, his eyes scanning them. You two okay? Marcus glanced at Evelyn. For the first time in days, she wasn't trembling. She wasn't running. She was free. Marcus nodded. Yeah, he said, his voice steady. We're okay. The sun was rising when they finally left the police station. The air felt different, lighter, warmer. Marcus stretched his arms, breathing in the morning air. It felt like he hadn't truly breathed in days. Evelyn stood beside him, her hands tucked into her jacket pockets. She looked at him, a small smile forming on her lips. You didn't have to help me, she said softly. Marcus chuckled. Yeah, well, I guess I'm just bad at minding my own business. She laughed, a real laugh this time. For the first time since this whole thing started, it felt like they weren't just surviving. They were starting over. A new beginning. And this time, they weren't running.